So I will start by thanking especially the teams that have been there. Professor Gerard gave us a very nice overview from Emmanuel. Oh, Salim, okay, thank you. So he was able, Professor Gerard helped us to understand and into the theoretical underpinnings in Immanuel Kant, then followed by Marita looking at how different groups engage in the space of environmental climate change issues. Then last week, I was very happy to hear from Robert sharing again his own perspectives on the question of advocacy and why it's very important that we dialogue with SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals. So we want to build on to that. I'm going to put in the presentation more, this coming slowly. We're going to build on to that, but just bringing out a theme that is very relevant to us, but at the same time also kind of controversial to many people. Many people don't like bringing gender studies within the academic sphere because of its controversies. But then because we are students who are looking at the convergence between religion and science, and in this particular space, how sustainable development goals are in dialogue with religion and science, we need to engage there. So I want to look at SDG number 3 that talks about health and well-being, for quality education, 3 about gender equality. Then how do we dialogue in this space? So SDG number 3 came very prominent during the COVID situation. I remember putting together a team of scholars, both here in Africa, that was Kenya, Tanzania, Uganda, Ethiopia, there was Zambia, there was Zimbabwe, South Africa. Then we went to the West, Ghana, Nigeria, and then we went to Tunisia, looking at health and well-being in view of the emerging COVID situation, and especially following the plight of migrants who are crossing the African deserts going to Europe. How do we make sure that they are healthy and they get good services wherever they go? Now, in this space, in most cases, we never talk about how women are affected mostly with this kind of situation. And this is exactly what I would like us to look at. Women, men, children in this space, but particularly women. So SDG number 3 talks about good health and well-being. Health is a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. And this week, if you look around, even within faith circles, even within my own church, my own parish, we are discussing mental health, things to do with the trauma, things to do with how to deal with depression, how to deal with the post-traumatic experiences we go through, maybe because of war, death, or now the situation of hurricanes in the US. Many people are going through that. So sometimes people think of health as the absence of disease and infirmity, but sometimes it's just how to be healthy, how to be happy, how to be contented. So the enjoyment of the highest attainable standard of health is one of the fundamental rights of every human being without distinction of race, religion, political belief, economic and social condition. So World Health Organization Constitution states that. So for us who are in religion and science, we need to cultivate ethical values that in health, sometimes we say health does it have any particular gender? When you're sick, you're sick. When you go to hospital, we should help you. And that has become a very contentious discussion nowadays. So World Health Organization defines health promotion as the process of enabling people to increase control over and to improve their health. And that is very, very important because most of us need to know how to control where we live, what we eat, what we access, because nowadays not everything is healthy. But then the terms apply to individuals as well as groups of people, families, communities, and environments. For example, physical, social, economic well-being is very, very important. So when we look at health as not just the absence of disease, but also satisfaction of the human person, then well-being is a positive state experienced by individuals and societies, as health is a resource for daily life and is determined by socio-economic and environmental conditions. Factors could be all aesthetics of life like music, theater, hiking, riding, sports, family quality time, nature. I'm always impressed when I hear somebody say, oh, I'm going to visit my grandchildren, or my grandchildren are coming, or I'm taking my dog for a walk. I was in New York recently and we were at the ground zero. And then a person came with his dog walking. Of course, they walk with a nappy, paper bag to make sure all the waste is collected. And we were just having a conversation, and this person says, the dog is the only companion I have in the house. I don't live with anybody, I have no relatives but my dog. But that dog gives total well-being to the human person. Well-being encompasses quality of life and the ability of people and society to contribute to the world with a sense of meaning and purpose. Well-being supports the tracking of equitable distribution of resources, overall thriving and sustainability. All societies' well-being can be determined by the extent to which it is resilient, builds capacity for action, and is prepared to transcend challenges. I keep highlighting the key concept to help us also learn if we're doing literature review or we're doing research, some of the terminologies or concepts that can determine the meaning of our study. For example, the concept of resilient. How resilient are you to situations that happen around you? The people are extremely strong, but some are not. How do we do that? And therefore, when you're looking at health and well-being, we're looking at the data from UNICEF. We start looking at how health and well-being of women, girls, is contemplated within our social setting. And especially when you're talking about maternal mortality ratio of 70 deaths per 1,000 live birth, related to pregnancy and childbirth around the world. Globally, that amounted to about 303,000 women in 2015. So when we're looking at different statistics of mortality ratio of 170 deaths per 1,000 births, which is lower than the global average of 2,600. So Central and Southeast Asia have a very serious problem. And when you look at, in that context of Kenya, Kenya has about 4.9 deaths per 1,000. This is estimate of 2024. Morocco, about 7 deaths per 1,000. Jordan, 3.5. Netherlands, I was surprised, have 9.7. Luxembourg, 7.5. So what's the determinant that we're able to access good health, and especially that mothers are able to be taken care of, especially at the time of giving birth? The children grow in safety and the children grow to become adults. So UN Women also advance women's well-being and health by working with governments to improve health services for women and girls, including survivors of violence, and backing non-governmental partners in filling the gaps. We strive to end practices that put women and girls in danger, such as child marriage, and support efforts to end discriminatory laws and practices impeding women's access to sexual and reproductive healthcare services. And so if we were to look at how our country is built towards this SDG, then we're looking at access to healthcare. This is one area of study I do also with the Nairobi City County. We have a very big study on data that we collect on maternal and child mortality, or the services we give to mother and child when the child is born. And then how do we make sure that they're healthy, they access services, that there's enough medicine. And you really are like Nairobi, there are over 300 health facilities connected to Pumwani Maternity Hospital. Pumwani is one of the largest hospitals for mothers to give birth in Nairobi. And it's linked to over 300 other hospitals or health facilities around in Nairobi. But at the same time, in this hospital, it's very easy to lose your child because the volume of mothers giving birth is very, very high. So how do we make sure that there's better control and better support? And so we are looking at this kind of study in every county in Kenya. And so when it comes to quality education, we're looking at SDG number 4, which talks about quality education. And SDG number 4 aims to ensure inclusive and equitable quality education and promote lifelong learning opportunities for all. This goal supports the reduction of disparities and inequities in education, both in terms of access and quality. So the question for us here would be, how do we make teaching and learning to contribute towards self-reliance and contributing to societal economic sustainability? This is a big problem, especially our countries of Africa, where we are still reeling from the colonial hangover. We followed a system of education that was very white-collar oriented. And so we value education in terms of grades you get. If you get an A, you're a good student. If you get a D, you're a bad student. And parents are seduced to think the same way. And so here we need to challenge that kind of perception. So in one of my studies, in 2020, I was writing, I think if Shete is here, I'll be the right person. Shete initiated a study with Jesuit Hakimani to understand whether education helps our young people to become self-reliant. And my paper was looking in terms of social transformation. What do you need to transform to bring about good valued education that makes our young people, when they drop out of high school, they can still be integrated into institutions of higher learning or tertiary institutions or some technical vocational education centers to improve on their skill. Because there has always been this culture of discarding or saying, because you failed the exam, you don't belong. And so in my argument was to review the Kenya system of education. And three conclusions were made. That when Kenya gained independence in 1963, education was for economic well-being. And who was benefiting that? The state. So you got education and you are employed to contribute to the state. The other one was that if you are going to good schools like Alliance and others, then you are bound to enter university. So good schools are always graded according to number 1 up to 100. And those who failed were never looked at. Then there was the other aspect where we looked at education of where education did not add the ethical values to how we use that education for. So you'd find that, okay, you got a D, and so we value you according to a D or an E. And even now, in our political setting, you'll hear somebody say, oh, you got a D, so how can you be a minister for trade? Okay, there's that one. But there's the other aspect of, the ethics of learning is to do what? If it's not collectively benefiting all of us, then what is it? So do I need to have a very good grade to be a very good person? Or the value of education should make me a good person to be able to be responsible in society, so that when I'm given a responsibility, I'm able to execute it justly for the benefit of many. And so in Kenya, if you look at the kind of education we get, we find that we have been introduced to an education that is about passing exams, but not about skills development. And so the key models of teaching and their value today need reviewing. We have been introduced to Montessori, Froebel, Waldorf, Reggio Emilia. Some of these are models that have been tried out. Here in Tangaza, we have the institute, we call it Christ the Teacher Institute of Education, but actually following the LASA model of teaching, where we help young people or those who join or those who become teachers to train towards self-reliance. Who then needs learning, the teacher or the student? That is usually a controversial question, because when we are being introduced to new technology, both the student and the teacher should learn at the same time to be able to introduce new ideas for sustainability. And therefore, the question of education is also influenced by Prometheanism principle of innovative learning or remaining stuck to the regurgitative learning or ruminative learning. So we do exams and then you repeat exactly what the teacher gave you, rather than education helping to be creative in how you answer a particular question. And so when we were looking at education adding value to lives of young people so that tomorrow they can be more responsible, then we started looking at the different education systems from a faith perspective and private schools that are owned by individual persons. So we find that in Kenya now, private schools tend to do better than national government-run schools. But why? Why is that the case? That the small school can take so many students to university, but big schools cannot. So we need to review that. And therefore, some of the statistics that we need to review always are that, for example, in 2017, when UNESCO did a survey on students going to school, the Kenya was an interesting case. Actually, they used Kenya as a case study. So about 1.3 million people who were enrolled for school in 2007, about 800,000, 7% sat for final exam. So you ask, then what happened to 600,000? Okay, the same report looks at the situation in Africa, and it showed that about 63 million students of school-going age, 34 million or more, or then half of that were able to finish school out of 63. Then what happened to the rest? In addition, of the global 139 million upper secondary school age youth, more than half of all youth in this bracket were out of school in sub-Saharan Africa, making 58% of the total school dropout by 2017. So in Kenya, if you sit for high school education, usually it's about 600,000. And out of 600,000, about 140 or 50,000 will join university. Then what happens to this big number, about 450,000, 550,000? What happens? Then we ask, then is education really adding value to self-sustainability, or making us become more and more dependent on the system rather than being creative? And that's why you could hear a very famous advert in Kenya when there are floods. Your house is under floods, and you know that every year there are floods there, and you are sitting in the middle of your house asking the government to help you. And that culture of asking the government to help you goes all the way from the village up to even national level. That if you're elected a member of parliament, you become a poor person because everybody depends on you. And if you don't deliver, you're not going to be elected next time. And so what has happened to education system, that we're not able to absorb everybody in their rightful space? That's a question for us to discuss. Then the other SDGs number 5, and I like it because SDG number 5 is about empowering women and achieving equality. Okay. And so we hope to achieve the gender equality by 2030. That's what we say. And then there are 5 pillars of SDG for 2030 agenda. And these pillars help us also to enter to the space of dialogue. But then this SDG number 5 of empowering women and achieving equality also raises a lot of concern. What is it that we are looking for when we talk about empowering women and achieving equality? So we need to go into a space within each country and ask, so are we able to budget? Are we able to build equality? Are we able to bring about economic justice? And are we able to invest in women to achieve what we want to achieve? And investing in women benefits women and society as a whole. That is what we even this year in a study done towards International Women's Day around the 8th of March, 10th of March, is to understand why we need to invest in women, because investing in women builds society as a whole. And most of us, of course, if we go to our cultures, most of us respect our mothers very much. There is a president of a certain country, where I can't even name the country, then you'll know, who would be sitting in a meeting, and the moment you mention his mother, the meeting is over. He not want anybody to talk about his mother. That shows how much respect we have for our mothers. But if we have so much respect for our mother, why don't we have so much respect for our girls to get good education? Okay. So at the current rate of investments, however, more than 340 million women and girls will still live in extreme poverty by 2030. This was the statistics of this year in February. It has never been more urgent to advance women's economic empowerment, as marked by the 2024 theme for International Women's Day. Invest in women, accelerate progress. So there are 5 ways to enable women. Explainer on boosting empowerment, ways to boost economic inclusion, resources, jobs, time, and security. So how do we enable women? Through resources building, jobs creation, time, and security. Resources. Connecting women with financial resources can help them meet their basic needs and start to grow businesses. However, it's estimated that micro, small, and medium-sized businesses owned by women globally are underfunded by you in terms of US dollar 1.7 trillion. So that's the gap. If we were to spend $1.7 trillion on giving opportunity to women, then we'd have cut poverty by a very large margin. So closing the credit gap for women on small and medium enterprise would result in a 12% increase in annual incomes on average by 2030. So when you're looking at SDG number 5, we need to address it in this perspective. In addition to financial resources, women need access to land, information, technology, and natural resources. In 2022, 2.7 billion people still lacked internet access, which is fundamental for getting jobs or starting businesses. And in this respect, women in rural areas hardly even access internet or the modern technology they deserve. And so when you're looking at in terms of resources, we need to see how do we invest in women to contribute to the coffers of the family total income. There are some cultures which would stop women from owning any business. And some cultures also argue that, okay, whatever the woman makes is for the man. And we have seen that in Kenya, this area of Nyeri, specifically Mokuruini, where they have had very low births. When President Kibaki came to power, 2003, the first thing he did was to quarrel with the men in Mokoroeni part of Kenya. And he was telling them, no, look here, you men, you sit in public space, smoking, drinking, waiting for the women to sell their produce in the market. And then the moment they sell, you pull out a machete or a knife and threaten them and take their money. And then you go back to drinking. But what they never did, what the government never did, was to do a situation analysis. But why is it that the men sit in a marketplace? Because in that region, men traditionally were herdsmen and they were the protectors of the community. They were the warriors. And so they protected the community against invaders. But now that role has changed with the time. So while we were talking about women's economic growth, enabling empowerment, we never talked of men's economic growth and empowerment. That's a question to discuss. Jobs. When women thrive in the world of work, they are better positioned to exercise their agency and realize their rights. But not just any job will do. Work must be productive and in conditions of freedom, equity, security, and dignity. Nonetheless, nearly 60% of women's employment globally is in the informal economy. And in low-income countries, this is more than 90%. So we have never valued household work as a job that should earn an income. And that goes with the time. That existing social organization of care reflects profound inequalities of status and power and often exploits the labor of women and girls. On average, women spend around 3 times more time on unpaid care and domestic work than men. Care work remains undervalued and underpaid. The monetary value of women's underpaid care work globally is at least US dollars 10.8 trillion annually, 3 times the size of the world's tech industry. So, and care, work in care industry is very much undervalued. Yet, if it is valued, it is more than even the tech industry. Yet the tech industry is taking over every option that could be there for economic growth. So the other question that comes out in making sure that we boost women's empowerment to boost economic inclusion is security. Women face numerous threats to their security, including gender-based violence, conflict, food insecurity, and lack of social protection. Violence at home or in places of work is a violation of women's rights and impedes their economic participation. The global cost of violence against women is estimated to be at least 1.5 trillion US dollars, approximately 2% of global gross domestic product. Now, this is a very important question because sometimes when you talk of security, you talk of food security or physical security, but then we never talk of just, question of rights as a security that can help people to live together and be productive. And why is it the case? Because different cultures treat women differently. So we, as students of religion and science, need to enter into that space and dialogue and ask, where are these gaps that you should fill in? And so gender-based violence can come from very familiar situations. I was working with a student who came from a Somali community and in the area of Nairobi called Eastleigh. Eastleigh is a very vibrant area with a very large Somali community. And this lady thought that the men in that community would never allow her to educate women on business and how to make money. But then when she started doing her research, she found that the men were very receptive. The only problem was the language that suits the culture, because in this culture, the man is supposed to be the provider for the family. So if you humiliate a man, then you're not allowed him to do business. So how to quote your language so that it fits within the culture, but you're able to show sense that this is the case. So the first time the student was starting her research, I was actually the fourth supervisor to work with her. The first, they quarreled. The second, they quarreled. The third, they quarreled. So when she wanted to drop out, they said, oh, okay, Reginald, why don't you work with her? So we did a situational analysis. At first, her study was to show that, men are brutes, they're evil, they're bad, they fight, they create violence, so I cannot work with them. But now when we started doing a situational analysis, we found out that actually even the Somali men wanted their women to have an economic base because collectively they can contribute to the income of the household. So the moment she saw that picture and did an about turn, the first entry point was to go to the mosque and be allowed to speak on a Friday afternoon. And she also dressed up respectfully, covered her head with a hijab, went to talk to the imam. Imam gave her the permission, and she spoke. And when she spoke, all the men were clapping. Yes, we want our women to be economically strong, to support our families, and to be able to move forward. But the secret was that when they do that, you should show that the man is really the one doing the work, so that doesn't feel humiliated, because humiliation in some cultures results to death. So do we understand security in terms of giving support to women so that we boost the empowerment and also boost the economic inclusion? And this lady right now, as I'm speaking, she's now the director of Ibru TV in Nairobi. We still communicate, we still talk, and we still develop other women to reach her level. The last one is rights. Most of us who also study governance, we always talk of the principles of governance. We talk of transparency, accountability, participation. Then the things about inclusion come in. Then there's something about rule of law. And then there's a whole study of rights. The reason why we don't just say human rights is because rights by itself is endless. How many rights exist? Could be 1 million rights. Do we really know all of them? And within the space of rights, then we need to know which are human rights, which are environmental rights, which are driving rights, which are domestic rights. So there are very many rights. So if we just concentrate on one aspect of human rights, then we stop ourselves from understanding the other rights that exist. And that's why human rights is one of them that we need to explore in terms of women's economic empowerment. There are some unjust patriarchal economic systems that perpetuate gender inequality and discriminatory social norms that stand in the way of women's access to information, networks, jobs, and assets. And so there are other scholars who have come into this space to say, do we really understand rights? And do we really explain rights within the culture? And so there's a very famous scholar in University of Anglia. We used to call her the scholar of Millennium Development Goals, because Millennium Development Goals from the year 2000 to 2015. So she used to enter that space of gender and how women are discussed within the Millennium Goals. Then she moved now to Sustainable Development Goals. So in the Millennium Development Goals, there should be a discussion on what is the rights that women should really enjoy to live a life of dignity. And so Cecilia Jackson, University of Anglia, you can Google her up, used to argue that yes, women should be given an opportunity to participate in every economic development that exists in every society without discrimination. But then in some cultures, women will not be allowed to get out of the home to do business or participate in any activity that improves their livelihood. And so Cecil Jackson, having worked with the Oxfam International, she happened to go to Saudi Arabia, and then she was observing. Then she went some countries in the Middle East. She was observing some countries in Africa. Then she said, sometimes the way we discuss rights should be culture specific. So how do we make sure that women access income or funds or access lending facilities to be able to stand on their own? But in these cultures, it's expected that women will wake up in the morning, prepare children for school, then they report to school. Then what do women do between 9 and 3 p.m.? That's a moment now to take them to school and learn how to make money. But how do you then bring in the husband to be part of this process? Then the husband has to be involved. And by doing that, you're protecting women's rights, but also improving the access to economic well-being. And therefore, you build networks and job structures that are culturally located, but also internationally accepted to help women to circumvent challenges they face within that space. And therefore, globally on average, women have only 64% of the legal rights enjoyed by men. Key strategies to promote women's rights in the context of economic empowerment include adoption of laws and policies that support women's economic empowerment and repeal discriminatory laws and legal frameworks. So when you're looking at SDG number 3, we're talking about health and well-being. What does that mean within the context of our own countries? Then we are looking at SDG number 4, is about access of quality education. What does that mean? Then you are coming to SDG number 5 that looks at gender and what we mean by gender. And so when we're entering that space, then we as students of religion and science need also to conduct research that helps us to understand where we are coming from. And so one of the key discussions that has emerged maybe in the last 40, 50, 60 years is the question of gender and feminism within this space of sustainable development goals. And so when I was looking at the UN reports, especially the Socio-Economic Council of 1946, the UN Socio-Economic Council, 1946, was very good because it provided space for everybody to enter there and to contribute to economic well-being of society. But it required scholars who are women to enter into that space to interrogate and ask, why is it that we have a very clear structure within the UN that supports the social well-being of men and women, but women tend to be discriminated against? And so in the empirical data, Kenya became a case study for most of the economic models from 1960. Kenya was always like the example. And then in the West, you find Ghana. And then in the South, there'll always be Zambia, Zimbabwe, or Rhodesia. And then they will compare. So those countries will be compared against the other. Even Malawi was always a case study. Tanzania later. But in those debates, it was only other Scandinavian scholar like Esther Bossarab, when she's looking at agribusiness and agricultural development in Ghana, and then later on in Kenya, looking at how women participate in the economic development of the household. And what I want to say now is where the controversies emerge in academia, where the controversy emerges sometimes in research. So you read Esther Bossarab looking about economic development and participation of women in Ghana. Then you use the same model to look at economic well-being and development in Kenya or Malawi or Zambia or Zimbabwe or South Africa. You might find that your data might be faulty, might be wrong, because you're comparing two situations that are not one and the same. So Esther Bossarab, having gone to Ghana, she was being critiqued or criticized by Kenyan scholars, especially people like Maria Nzomo. And then there's another lady called Pala. Then also Cameroonian scholars like Mudimbe. Mudimbe came to learn was a religious sister. Say, when you want to critique a particular society, go into the context and look at the primary data that exists to understand why. For example, when Esa Bosarab, in her very nice book, published 1966, then later on in a very clear topical discussion, Women and Development 1970, argues that in this particular culture, women are working and working, but men are sitting at the top of the mountain smoking, not participating in the chores played by women. Now, when Kenyan feminist scholars were reading that literature, and some of them also from Ghana were reading the same literature, they said, no, I think there was a mistake somewhere. The women will start working from 7 to 11, uprooting cassava or manioc, but then the men will be the one pushing on wheelbarrows this manioc to the market, because the manioc could be too heavy for the women to push. So there was shared labor. There was no discrimination. But future gender feminist studies use that as a model to show discrimination or disproportionate support to women given in particular working situations. And so when it came to 1970, then come up this discussion on women in development. And so the first conference of women development was in Nairobi. And from Nairobi, they set up what they call the caucus to discuss women in development. And then 1972, the first caucus meeting in Cancun in Mexico, I think that's what it is. Then later on, 1975, we have the first conference on women in development, again in Mexico. Then 1985 in Nairobi. It was women in development 1985, but towards the end they say women in development and gender and development. Then 1995, Beijing, and later on. So we need to know this historical background to build our data to understand. And that brings us then to understand societies in Africa, especially which are matrilineal. We have communities in Malawi, and also that are patrilineal. Then how do they address the question of gender? And I've not yet come across a man who is married in a matrilineal society, how he is treated. Is he discriminated against, or is he welcomed? Or how does it work? At least patrilineal societies we know. So when we are discussing gender and feminism, we need to understand that. And we have had very many good cases where, like in Asante Kingdom or the Asante people of Ghana, have a very clear court for the king and a court for the queen. Oromo people also of Ethiopia, who spread even to parts of Kenya, have a similar structure. So when we're looking at gender and feminism within the structure of SDG number 5, we need to be very clear. What are we talking about? Who is involved? In which country? In which community? Don't generalize. Okay? And so one of the emerging debates today, and even just now, I have a PhD student who is an advocate of High Court, who is looking at widows' property inheritance rights in Nyeri County, the role of customary law, statutory law, and court system, and the traditional clan system in articulating the rights of women to property inheritance. If we don't enter into the cultural debate, we may lose the whole aspect of rights and justice. And so when we enter this space, one of the core areas of discussion that I found very interesting was to differentiate what they call Western feminism and African feminism. Big difference. So when you look at gender and looking at it from a Western feminism, then they'll be looking at theories that look at radical feminism, Marxist feminism, liberal feminism, and difference. From an African perspective, there's a bit of emphasis that leans towards Western feminism, but African feminism is so different. They look at things like motherism, feminalism, and there's something about how do you belong as a woman in an African context. In an African context, we don't call a married woman by her married name. We call her like the mother of so-and-so or the father of so-and-so. So the question of belongingness. Now, when you belong, what does that mean when your husband dies and leaves you property? What is the law of the land saying about property inheritance? And so there are very many interesting African scholars. One of my favorites is called Naomi Nikela from South Africa, who claims to be a liberal, self-reliant scholar pushing the African feminist lens. And she's very strong on the concept of belongingness. Belongingness is becoming a theory now. How do you belong? If you're within the Luo culture of Kenya or maybe pastoralist community, you belong when people bring dowry. But in modern sense, how do you belong? They say you in the modern sense, belong if you have been married officially, whether through the church or customary, but if you have a child, and so your child makes you to belong. And if you don't have a child and then your husband died, then the property is not yours. So these are the kind of concepts that come up. How do you belong? So belongingness in gender and feminist studies becomes a very interesting concept, which also affects how we dialogue with religion and science within the African perspective and within the Western perspective. Okay. So there are certain perspectives within the African culture that are very strong. So when somebody says, I've seen that my younger sister is a nun, and when she was taking her perpetual vows, it was done in our parish. And because she did not have a house of her own, so she used my house as the home of being betrothed to the church. And so everything was done from my house. And then officially now we started, even traditionally it fitted in very well. When you are called a sister, what does it mean in the African context? And if you are called a father, what does it mean? You are a sister to everyone, you are a father to everyone. So your brothers and sisters are actually all members of your clan and the people you associate with, even your brothers and all that. So in the question of belongingness, then it fits in very well. You're choosing to become a religious, choosing to lead a married life, choosing to be what you become. But belongingness is very, very important. So I wanted to emphasize this to bring in another aspect of how to look at gender, SDG number 5, and the question of gender. Okay. So I wanted to stop there so that we can have a bit of discussion. So remember the 3 things I was trying to deal with today. The first one was SDG number 3 and its challenges, especially accessing universal healthcare and how women are treated in this space. SDG number 4 was about education and quality education. Who should have really quality education? Then SDG number 5 that looks at gender. And within gender, we have so many perspectives that bring about the question of feminism. Or when, like I have a student, every time they talk about gender, they mean, with gender, they mean women. Then say, no, gender is about different roles played by men and women in a particular society. So why should it only be about women? But maybe because for a very long time, and especially the Constitution of Kenya, when I was looking at models of development of Kenya, I was really, really intrigued that when you talked of poverty, the only person to solve poverty was a man. And so the man came to the city to look for work to support his family in the rural areas. And so when he started evaluating household work done by the woman in the rural areas, it was a lot of work. Took care of the land, tilling, harvesting, milking the cows, paying off the workers. And if you go, especially come from Western Kenya, that is the situation. Women were really the custodians of the house, the homestead. But the men came to the urban to look for work. And so they could not go back and do the same work with their women. And so we never valued the work done by women. And that's why from 1970 now, the perspective changes. If you're in the urban, you're working. In the rural, the woman is also working. So are you not contributing to the household economics? And so from a perspective of faith, religion and so on, then how would we interpret that? Good. So I've made a bit of comments, I've thrown the ball into your court. So let us discuss a little bit.
Can I have a question, please?
Christopher, go ahead.
Okay, I just want, I'm working with children only, and the presentation was quite interesting for me. India is a huge country with a population of 1.3 billion people, out of which 40% are children. And we have a similar situation here, challenges that you very clearly mentioned. One thing that we have a big challenge is that in the quality education, we are focusing more on nutritional foundation for children from 0 to 5 years old, because we found that one of our data that says that child who is not properly fed in the early stages of life, that is 0 to 5 years, nutrition foundation not given to a child, then the child is easily stunted or wasted. Stunted when the child doesn't grow properly, and even the cognitive thing doesn't happen. That means the intelligence development doesn't take place there, and child is inactive. And also stunt wasted. Wasted is another term. What child is when the child goes to the school, the child is a kind of a natural dropout. So there kind of a big injustice being done in most part of. I'm not. It's happening. It is quite visible in my work, and I feel very sad because when the children go to school, they are slow learners, and so there is important aspect comment I want to make, that laying proper nutrition foundation is very important. I'm not talking about just feeding. I'm talking malnutrition status. That means if a child is not provided proper protein, if the diet is not balanced, and it's just not feeding the child only with the rice, because it doesn't help the child. So the nutrition foundation is quite important for quality education, because and as a result, what happens is that the child is totally stigmatized. The teacher looks at the child and says, you're a slow learner, you're a lazy fellow," and there again the child is getting abused, physical abuse, or also, and it becomes a kind of a stigmatized. That means you're used good for nothing. So kind of a thing that is happening. Quite a big large number of children is happening in my area. So that's one thing I just want to add a comment, that laying a foundation in nutrition is very important. That's when all the government schools, we have what is called the midday meal, where the government gives food to the children, to the kids. The one aspect, and second, the biggest challenge I'm finding is that commercialization of education. We are in a capitalistic type of society, and as a result, what is that? There's a public school and the private school. The private school, basically, I'm talking of international schools, where the politicians, where the rich people, they set up international schools when standards are quite high. The fees is very high, and all cannot. It's just only cream of the society send the children teaching, but the migrant workers, the domestic workers, people, children who are in the security sector. So all these children of the with low social economic status and low caste people go to the government schools. So there kind of huge discrimination that is happening, swing happening between the commercial education, although there is free and compulsory education set by the government. So there's a these are the challenges that I just want to share in context of education.
No, you are making very fundamental points, because even in early years, I remember when I was growing up, I grew up in Nairobi and I had to go to school. We were given free meals and we had free milk, because it's fundamental to feed the children well. And what you're doing is really commendable, because to be able to access quality education, you need to have food. And then if you don't feed children very well from the age of 0 to 5, then they're bound to develop rickets, weak bones, they lack vitamin D so that the body can absorb minerals to help bones grow and maintain bone strength. There are moments of where people are, starvation is induced as a political tool to punish others. That should not be allowed. I've worked with a missionary priest who was born during the Second World War, 1942. And during that period, they only used to get 1 meal per week. So if you go to a meal on Monday, there's no food until the next Monday. So he was growing up and he was developing rickets, and even standing became a problem. By good luck, when the Allied forces came in, that was in Italy, they started now getting at least 3 rations per week, and then 5, then they went back to normal food. So poor feeding can actually be a hindrance to quality education. Thank you very much. Yes, yeah.
Professor Reginald, say the last point that you made, that while the African idea of feminism is more along the line of belongingness, whereas the Western concept is very much emphasizing the right dimension, is it not? While listening to this explanation, I was just wondering whether does this idea of belongingness anything contribute further to the enhancement of the empowerment of the women without due recognition of the rights of women. So the idea of belongingness, does it also incorporate the Western ideals of right, privileges, and so on, which are new concepts discovered by the feminist philosophers and theologians? And also, a second point, I will be curious, since we are dealing with science-religion dialogue. So religion is considered to be often, especially the Christian tradition, even without allowing ordination of women in the Catholic tradition, quite often religion is considered to be traditional orthodox, not coping up with the progress that the secular world is making. So when we look at the role of women and SDGs, do you think that religion, science-religion dialogue can be helpful for the promotion of the women, or will it be still holding on to the conservative position? This is just a general question. I would be happy to give your response, Reginald.
The question, maybe just comment on the question of belongingness, is very, very interesting in the African context. We have had in Tangaza here, the Merino Institute of African Studies, and we used to do research in different communities. How do you belong? The question of dowry was very, very important because it cemented relations. And dowry was not about buying or selling a woman. No, it was about appreciation. And some communities, dowry never ends. I'm told they could say 150 goats, but it just means that throughout your life, you belong to each other and you are cemented with these two communities. But now it comes to the modern understanding of belongingness. How do you belong? And I think that question is creating controversy, especially when our young people or the Gen Z youth get together and they say, we are getting married, and the parents don't know. Do you really know who you are? And of recent years, we're beginning to realize it's very easy to marry your sister without knowing that you're marrying your sister. So the cultural perspective of socialization also brought people together, and that's how people belonged. And lastly on this is also, I used to participate in plays, but there's one by the Luo community in part of Lake Victoria region called Duogo. Duogo is a woman who lives in the city, and then she passes away, but she has a child, and then she has to be buried. Then where will she be buried? In the father's home or outside the home? So that helped me to start thinking about belongingness. So every culture has a way of defining belongingness, but in the modern era of Gen Z, we need to be very clear how to help our young people to understand how they belong and where they belong. And so it will incorporate questions of rights, and then now rights become very complicated. From which perspective? Is it from the parent side or from the side of the young person? So it's a question that needs to be more explored, but if I look at it in terms of the community giving blessing to you to be what you become, then there is a very sense of belongingness there, because at least you went to the community and you told them, I'm moving on with this calling or this vocation, then therefore I need your blessing. Just like in the Old Testament. Then the African father or mother will say, oh, please go in peace, my son, my daughter, you have my blessings. And then that one now ties in very well with the question of belongingness, especially when people become religious or join a religious life. Now, this aspect of, we are making progress in the world, but then at the same time, we are captured within our cultural heritage. And so when you talk of ordination of women, then you are asking yourself, from which cultural heritage are we in? And that becomes very interesting. But at the same time, myself, if I was to interact with that space, I'm not offended or feeling discriminatory at all. And so when I was at the World Parliament of Religion, I was laughing with, it was a nice sense of humor. It was really, really nice when I was talking to some of the women who are pushing for ordination of women, and I respect them for that. But then when you come to the cultural perspective, that the modern progress or what the world wants to be does not run at the same speed as the cultural heritage that people live in. So then that role becomes kind of diluted or it loses value. Another perspective, I lived in England and I was part of the ecumenical movement. But then I was always intrigued by mostly the Anglican women wanted to be ordained priests. That's okay. And even I was part of the team that was supporting that. But now when they were given parishes, they never had parishioners. Now that one intrigued me. What? We have been fighting for you to become a priest. On Sunday, you go to church and there are no people. So what did we do not do right? We never did situational analysis, to do census analysis, to ask people's opinion. And people honestly speak from the heart. That perplexed me. And it still perplexes me even today. And so in 2010, when Pope Benedict was coming to England, I was part of the organizing team representing my community of Oxford. Now I interacted with these scholars who have been championing ordination of women. But we have walked away from that. That's overtaken by events. We don't want it anymore. And then they also reminded me, our friend was ordained priest, but when she went to run a parish, everybody ran away. So, Father, you said something very interesting, that the progress in the world may not walk at the same speed with the cultural heritages that we live in. Yeah? Peter Dambuki, do you agree?
Reginald.
Yes, go
So,
ahead.
friends, if anybody has any comments, so friends, you can come up with your comments or questions, anything further. We have a couple of few minutes left. Sister Jane has raised her hand. Jane, could you please make your intervention now?
Yeah, thank you very much, Professor Reginald. And sorry, I came a little bit late. We had another event, but I caught up. And what fascinates me very much is the SDG number 5. It talks about like gender equality. And I keep on asking myself, and maybe it's not a question, maybe how can we address the patriarchal part of it? Because no matter how many SDGs will come under this planet, the patriarchal system will still stand. And I look at it, you have touched it a little bit when you said about the ordination of women. That one I'm never interested. But in the reality of the society of today, how do we still address this patriarchal? And you coming from Kenya, I give you an example of this governor of Meru that was being impeached. And I followed it very religiously. And all it was because she's a woman. It's as if they made a mistake putting this woman there. So how do we still address that? Even as within our project, we find ourselves that if a man comes, we say, can you say the prayer? Father, can you say the prayer? Where a sister can say, and Father bless. So how do we still remove our mindset with this patriarchal that cuts across? Thank you.
Maybe what you could say, sister, how do we deal with matriarchal systems within the family? Yeah, that was actually the balance. That is what I was talking about. In African context, you need to be very holistic how you define it. Eh? Because if you lean on one side, you make mistakes. If you lean on the other, you make mistakes. And that's why we have this dialogue of religion and science. So what's the dialogue? So the dialogue should be between matriarchal and patriarchal systems. And that's what I was asking. If there is somebody who is married into a matriarchal system, how do they relate? And that's a good piece of research actually to inform us. And so patriarchy and belongingness. And again, you need to understand the governor of Meru within the context of patriarchy and belongingness. And if you go deeper, the question was not because she was a woman, but what she did as a woman, maybe that was interesting. And so we go into the social analysis, then we realize that, oh, it was not because the society was patriarchal, because we have another governor in Kirinyaga who seemed to be doing well, and even she was being groomed to become the deputy president. What did she do right that the other did wrong? Remember, she's called Governor Waiguru. Governor Waiguru, when she became governor, nobody knew her husband. But the moment she became governor, remember, Sister Jane, she formalized her marriage very fast.
Yeah.
And that cemented, closed the chapter, she belongs, you see?
Yeah.
So that theory of belongingness is very important to understand in this context. And nobody talks about Waiguru anymore.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. Okay.
But Dr. You see, like where she comes is a different level of culture. When you look the like ethnicity, also the culture of that part of the country is very strong. It's how it looks at a woman. That's what I'm looking at. But where I come from, it doesn't matter whether you are a woman. I come from a county. They are all women that took leadership, starting from the governor almost to the grassroots. But right. I think it's where the culture is very strong. Yeah, I'm looking at it that way.
Again, that is Nakuru County, isn't it? Sister Jane, Nakuru County.
Yeah.
Again, you do a situation analysis, but why? Is that they were all women or they belong to the right political party? And so the political mood was just right at the right time.
Okay, Harun Tuku, I am not sure if I pronounce your name correctly. Could you please show up yourself now?
Yes, that's the pronunciation.
Ah.
I also wanted to continue with gender, Dr. Reginald, and I'm glad for your response to Sister Jane, because my thought was the defense of the governor was she's being impeached because she's a woman and not defending the wrongdoings she's accused with. But I wanted you to comment on the contextualization of feminism, because in the case of Kenya, how can we have women leaders and maybe in our culture not regard them as our elders? How can we marry that with the culture that has always been, and maybe make them belong to us as leaders? And is it possible?
So again, depending on the school of thought you look at, if you look across from African religious perspective, you find very many women who are prophetesses, who are rainmakers. Even now, I know 2 or 3 of them in Zimbabwe and South Africa, who are very respected because of the value they add to community in terms of rainmaking or healing and all that. So that is there. But where it becomes a challenge is the modern way of comparing what is emerging, the popular culture with the traditional culture. And therefore, if you look at most of our communities where women come from, it's very difficult to find a woman who just sits and waits for things to be done. Women are very, very proactive. They do a lot of work. They can be able to read between the signs and make things happen. Whether it's in a funeral, in a wedding, their roles are very clear. So women show leadership. But we never define leadership in terms of the work they do. We define leadership on the type of seat they sit on. And that's perhaps where we need to dialogue more and understand what does it mean to be a leader. It doesn't mean that you carry your seat and bring it to the meeting, or you show leadership by the work you do. So that's a question for Harun to think through. Thank you.
Yeah, Professor Jerry.
Unmute.
Jerry, you need to unmute your microphone.
We have many women who have studied with GMU who have gone on and become ordained in the Catholic tradition in the United States. And some of our faculty are in that group. And they have just recently, when the Pope went to Belgium, excuse me, to meet for the 600th anniversary of Louvain University, he was confronted with his views on women as being out of touch with the modern world. I don't know if you followed that, but this is the situation that the United States, we have many women who have been ordained and actually have small communities, probably 20 or 30 now. And so this is a movement that is moving fast. And I think with possibly a woman president coming to the United States finally, women's roles are changing dramatically in the world. And I don't think religion can hold it back any longer. Even patriarchal cultures are changing. Well, in order to participate in the modern world, women have to have equal rights. And I think all churches, not just the Catholic Church, but even some of the evangelical churches do not have adequate theology of women. So I think GMU is playing a key role in training women who want to go on to be leaders in their culture, whether it's through religion and science or through pastoral ministry. These are often small, intentional communities. They're not parishes in the traditional sense, but this is part of the movement of religion today out of its present institutional framework into a more egalitarian kind of framework.
Then, okay, thank you everyone. Bye for now. We meet on next Friday for the last input by Professor Reginald himself.